Hello, I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of our Spring Creative Thought Forum events. This year, the focus is on fact and fraud in a digital age. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge that SAR is located on the traditional lands of the Tewa people, Ogapoge Owinge, White Shell Water Place, Santa Fe, New Mexico. A complete list of our sponsors was presented at the beginning of the webinar, worthy of special mention are the Pelahema Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, Mark Sublet and Medicine Man Gallery, Adobo Catering, and members of the SAR Founder Society. We're also grateful to the underwriters and supporters who've helped to make this specific talk possible. These include Dan Marians of UBS Financial Services, First National 1870 Bank, Darlene Street, Santa Fe Real Estate Property, New Mexico Bank and Trust, and Walter Burke Catering. I'd also like to thank our SAR members and those of you who made voluntary donations to support today's program. It's through your generous support that we're able to offer these online programs free of charge and make them accessible to a national and international audience. If you're not already a member, we invite you to join SAR. We've recently launched a virtual membership for just $25 for new members. You can visit our website for more information on that. Philip J. Deloria is the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard, where his research and teaching focus on the social, cultural, and political histories of relations among American Indian peoples and the United States, as well as the comparative and connective histories of indigenous people in a global context. His many publications include the books Playing Indian, 1998, Indians in Unexpected Places, 2004, and along with Neil Salisbury, also a historian, he co-edited the Blackwell Companion to American Indian History. He received his doctorate from Yale and is taught at the University of Colorado and the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He serves as a trustee of the National Museum of the American Indian and chairs the museum's repatriation committee. I now give you Philip Deloria.
Greetings, I'm coming to you from Odawa Territory in northern Michigan. In September 1778, in the midst of the War for Independence, the United States signed a treaty of alliance with the Delaware Nation. The Fort Pitt Treaty was part of a series of efforts to keep the Western Indians of the Ohio Country from allying with the British and to secure their military partnership in a planned assault on Detroit, a critical location for the British supply of their own native allies. For the Delaware, pressed on all sides by American settlers and other tribes, the treaty was a last-ditch effort to hold their territory, and it entailed the abandonment of a policy of neutrality. In return, the treaty guaranteed Delaware ownership of their lands, American protection against other tribes, and included this, mostly forgotten, but rather extraordinary promise found in Article 6. And it is further agreed on between the contracting parties should it for the future be found conducive for the mutual interest of both parties to invite any other tribes who have been friends to the interest of the United States to join the present Confederation and to form a state whereof the Delaware Nation shall be the head and have a representation in Congress. The passage is full of conditionals. The possibility required an American victory in the war, no sure thing in 1778. It assumed the Delaware and other tribes would demonstrate coherent long-term support for the American effort, which is also difficult to imagine. Both parties had to declare their mutual interest, and if it is hard to imagine the Delaware being interested, it is even harder to imagine the United States actually making good on its promise. The final sentence, like so many problematic passages in so many treaty texts, defers full and final authority to the US, barely functional though it was at the time. Provided nothing contained in this article to be considered as conclusive until it meets with the approbation of Congress. Today we read the passage and slowly shake our heads. Just another example of American perfidy, a little quirky to be sure, but not really different in kind from any other broken treaty promise. But what if we imagined otherwise? So close your eyes and take yourself back to March 10th, 1781, the day on which the 14th state joined the Union, the first addition to the original 13 colonies. This new state had declared its political autonomy, devised rules for the governance of its polity, and sent delegates to the Continental Congress. Its members had served during the War of Independence, and now they proudly joined the Union. I'm not talking about Vermont, which shared that story and was, in fact, the 14th state, but rather the new state of Lenape, populated by Indian people who paid taxes to the federal government and were counted, along with whole free persons, indentured servants, and 3/5 of all other persons, according to the 3/5 clause of the Constitution. The road to America's first Indian state had been an improbable one, to be sure. The US hoped for many other Indian signatories to the Fort Pitt Treaty and was likely disappointed to have recruited only the 3 Delaware leaders. But those 3 men turned out to be talented and sagacious. White Eyes was the speaker of the Delaware Nation. John Kilbuck was a hereditary chief. The Pipe was the war leader of the Wolf Clan. Together, they represented all 3 of the Delaware clans. And the Delaware, though buffeted by colonialism, migration, and resettlement, were still considered the grandfathers of an Indian world that stretched from the mid-Atlantic up into Canada, south into the Ohio River country, and west toward the Mississippi. In the fall of 1778, with the treaty freshly signed, American commander Lachlan McIntosh launched an expedition against Detroit, building an advanced base named Fort Laurens on the west bank of the Tuscarawas River. The effort was doomed to failure, and by February 1779, the British and their Indian allies had besieged the 150 soldiers who had been left at Fort Laurens for the winter. The best the Americans could muster in the Ohio country was George Rogers Clark mucking around in the far west and eventually capturing the British fort at Vincennes in August 1779. The Delaware took control over the situation, however, devising a daring plan of winter warfare. They rallied a large force of Delaware and allied warriors, pulled a reluctant McIntosh and his troops out of their winter quarters at Fort Pitt, relieved Fort Laurens, and marched straight through to Detroit, taking the fort and all its supplies in May 1779. While many of the tribal nations perceived American settlers as an existential threat and thus allied strongly with the British, other tribes were more open to persuasion, and the Delaware leaders set out to do just that. Rejecting McIntosh's offers to broker American treaties with these tribes, the Delaware built a separate and distinct Indian alliance, exactly the sort of alliance the Americans had encouraged in the 1778 treaty. It had become clear during the Detroit expedition that the Delaware, not the Americans, were firmly in control, and they continued the military initiative, assembling a growing native force and marching eastward across Upper Canada. In July 1779, they captured Fort Niagara, demolishing the infamous Tory militia, Butler's Rangers, killing its leader, John Butler, and freeing the imprisoned American officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Stacy, who demonstrated his gratitude by advocating for Delaware interests for the rest of his life. The late summer of 1779 was marked by an aggressive American campaign against the Haudenosaunee in the New York region, a vicious, total war that aimed to destroy villages, food, and the means of life. The so-called Sullivan Campaign was designed as a 3-pronged effort, with American armies moving west from Schenectady, north from eastern Pennsylvania, and north from Fort Pitt. Capturing Fort Niagara was a stretch goal for George Washington, a dream outcome. So imagine Washington's surprised pleasure then when Delaware leaders, working from their new base at the captured Fort Niagara, negotiated a Haudenosaunee withdrawal from the British alliance, a stance of neutrality, and a shift in Haudenosaunee leadership to the American allied Oneidas. Washington quickly pulled Sullivan's troops back, consolidating American strength in the New Jersey, New York, Philadelphia area. So with the northern theater of war quieted, the Delaware called an alliance meeting of tribes across western New York, northwestern Pennsylvania, and eastern Ohio, establishing a new native confederation, powerful and now well positioned to play balance of power diplomacy with the Americans and the British. With William Stacy and White Eyes undertaking shuttle diplomacy, the Delaware leaders pressed their case for recognition from the Continental Congress. Seeking to solidify the American alliance with the Delaware Confederation, Congress formally approved the Fort Pitt Treaty and designated the boundaries for a potential future Indian state located in the eastern corner of the Ohio country, of which the Delawares shall be leaders. Given the land claims of white speculators, the future state was hardly secure, but by the fall of 1779, it seemed to be not wholly impossible. This was indeed White-Eye's vision for the future, and he worked hard to keep the Delaware Confederacy together so as to press the effort further. In the first months of 1780, the Confederacy outlined its plans in a message to George Washington. A significant Confederacy force would hold the northern front against any potential British incursion, while the bulk of the Delaware Army moved into former Delaware territory, mustering at the Princeton area farm of the Indian agent George Morgan. Washington could press the British in the south with support along the Atlantic corridor from the Delaware. So the Delaware move to New Jersey was not coincident. Enrolled in the College of New Jersey was Shawulcomcombe, also known as Bartholomew Scott Calvin, the son of a Delaware interpreter and teacher who would become a next generation Delaware leader. White-Eye's son, George Morgan White-Eyes, was newly arrived in Princeton, living with George Morgan, who he was named for, and being educated in the English language, the better to attend the College of New Jersey, where he would enroll in 1785. Also arriving in Morgan's home in 1779 were the two sons of John Kilbuck, tutored by a teacher at the Nassau Hall Grammar School with the aim that they too would soon be able to attend the university that would one day be known as Princeton. Morgan's farm, Prospect, served as a political base for the Lenape leaders and these four leaders in training. With Delaware participation, the Southern campaigns of the spring and summer of 1780 proved highly successful. The British were in clear retreat. These were also the days when states were hotly contesting the Articles of Confederation, which assumed little in the way of central governance. Indeed, the Articles were a document of confederated alliance, not unlike the Confederation that had been assembled by the Delaware. First sent to the states for ratification in 1777, the Articles had been stalled out as states wrangled over claims to Western lands. 7 states, New York, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, had charters that they argued granted them land west to the Mississippi. Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Rhode Island were all landlocked or confined, and their resident land speculators pushed for access to Western lands. Landless states worried that Virginia, with claims to the Ohio country, would become a dominating megastate. Others were willing to cede their claims to the central government in return for a release from their war debts. Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania eventually proved willing to compromise on their Western claims. And Virginia finally agreed to cede its territory north of the Ohio River, which would then become the Northwest Territory. By 1780, the only state that had refused to ratify the Articles of Confederation was Maryland, but it was a determined holdout. Into this mess came White-Eyes, Kilbuck, the Pipe, their next generation leaders, and representatives from the Haudenosaunee, Shawnee, and other Confederacy tribes who pressed the political case under the Treaty of 1778 for formal recognition of an Indian state to be called Lenape and to be situated on Indian lands in the Ohio region. The war had created a unified Indian bloc, now firmly occupying the territory that would become Lenape, and the Delaware had recruited a number of allies along the way, including Washington, Henry Knox, William Stacey, George Morgan, and others. And so things moved fast in the late fall of 1780. The British surrender in December, followed shortly after by the dramatic appearance of the Delaware leaders before Congress. They pressed a compelling case. They made enormous contributions to the American war effort, effectively winning the Western War, finalizing the American campaign in the North, and supporting the successful Southern campaigns. They had established and led a confederation of tribes that, in fact, wished to press the case for statehood. They nurtured a strong set of leaders able to conduct the business of the state. And under the Confederation model, a firm league of friendship, the relative independence of an Indian state was not dissimilar to the political claims of other states, which had equally diverse origins, social systems, and political interests. And even though Western land speculators howled, the designation of the boundaries of Lenape helped break the logjam among the states. It was the compromise that allowed Maryland to sign the Articles of Confederation. Indeed, Lenape led the way in what would become the standard practice for the American empire, a refusal of the old charter land claims and the idea of elongated megastates running from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, and instead, the creation of new territories that would eventually become states. Lenape prefigured the process laid out in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, in which colonial territories were brought into the structure of the American empire. And so, in March 1781, Maryland ratified the Articles, and Lenape was formally recognized as the 14th state. It too ratified the Articles, blending its confederation, or at least some part of it, for the Indian alliance was too capacious for the small state, and a number of tribes did break off, but blending that alliance with that of the United States. Undoubtedly, without the disorder and bartering among the states, the significant wartime service rendered, the continued British threat, the reduction of the Haudenosaunee, strategic friends in Congress, and a cadre of Delaware leaders, these were educated Christian Moravians who constantly invoked the terms of the treaty, the state would not have come to be. As later Americans would argue about the words of the Declaration of Independence, the founders may not have believed them, but they wrote them. And the US has been, in a very real way, about holding those words to account. Well, the same held true for the Treaty of 1778. No one, with the exception of White Eyes, believed in Article 6 of the treaty, but they said the words and they signed the document. And the Delaware figured out through grand military strategy, savvy diplomacy, and cultural politics how to make the Americans recognize them as real. Lenape was not large. The state's many enemies made sure of that. But it was the first tenuous, reluctant instance in which the United States could be called a true multiracial democracy. The existence of Lenape, embattled and belittled, but determined, shaped the subsequent course of American history, making possible the post-War of 1812 state of Tecumseh, the incorporation of the Hawaiian Kingdom as an indigenous state, the Indian Territory state of Sequoia, and the indigenous-centric politics of the upper Midwestern and Southwestern states. Arguably, Lenape made possible the formal statehood of the United States' 20th century imperial acquisitions, including the state of Puerto Rico and the Pacific Confederated State, which might otherwise have lingered forever in ambiguous territorial status. It surely shaped post-Civil War Reconstruction as Lenape and Tecumseh continued their pre-war abolitionism into a full-throated support of African-American political autonomy in the southern states. Okay, so this did not happen. It did not even come close to happening. And with each passing month and each passing year after 1778, the more impossible it became and the more impossible it seems. And so why should anyone care about it other than as entertainment? Though I have to say, I do hope you found it entertaining. Well, I started thinking about the state of Lenape as a teaching tool, a counterfactual to get students to look closely at the various and sometimes surprising provisions found in treaties, and to seek out Indian goals and negotiating strategies in documents that often keep those goals hidden. It was a short step from there to start thinking about other oddball political formations and their relations to the American empire nation. Vermont, Texas, California, and Hawaii for sure. The lost state of Franklin, the ghost state of Jefferson, various claims and arguments about secession, West Virginia, the 1905 Indian Territory Convention to propose the new state of Sequoia, which really happened, and what turns out to be a deeply buried and slender thread over a century long in which a handful of individuals sincerely advocated for Indian states. Somewhere along the way, however, I started to find myself quite attracted to this story, and I began to wonder more about how we craft knowledge around such things as counterfactuals, historical speculation, what Saija Hartman famously named critical fabulation, and other methods of imaginative analysis and storytelling. Perhaps I took a bit too much delight in it in ways not appropriate for a serious historian. Well, there's no reconciling history and non-history, but the fable does suggest a few questions for further contemplation. First, are there any points of plausibility in my imaginative account? And what might those points reveal? Second, can we use the fabulous account to clarify the forces arrayed against American Indian people, the events and meanings of events and things that slammed the doors shut on Article 6 of the 1778 treaty. Does looking at what actually happened somehow look different because we have considered this particular possibility? And third, what kinds of stories are we telling when we engage in counterfactual, critical fabulation, speculation, historical fiction, and other efforts that push the boundaries of the fact archive? In a complex philosophical piece in the American Historical Review, Martin Bunzel offers a brief, in a manner of speaking, for counterfactuals, suggesting that applying historical tools, rules and laws, causality, logic, to indirect evidence situates counterfactuals among other forms of informal or heterodox methods. Bad counterfactuals are bad because they are purely imaginative. Good counterfactuals try to ground themselves in historical logics. John Lewis Gaddis suggests something similar, that a good counterfactual adjusts a single variable and uses the case to reflect upon that one variable. If you adjust multiple variables, you're just making things up. At the same time, as he observes, any form of historical thinking, of asserting, sorting, and assessing causal factors implicitly requires a parallel assessment of the counterfactuals, those things that might have happened but did not. So in an effort to be good, let me begin by offering at least a few intriguing notes on the question of plausibility. What might have happened? Let's say that Article 6 is the variable. It is the quirk, the contingency, the thing that remains hard to explain. It's possible that Article 6 came from someone close to the Continental Congress. The first treaties recorded between Indians and Americans beginning in 1775 do not use formal legalistic language, but rather follow the older colonial practice of a detailed journal of speakers and what they had said. The 1778 treaty, by contrast, was exceedingly legal. It was one of the very first treaties to take such form. Historian Edward Williams suggests that the professional form of the text, the absence of anyone present at Fort Pitt with the necessary legal training to write such a text, and the last-minute nature of the instructions to the treaty commissioners suggests that the text had been previously prepared and sent to those commissioners. He observes the reluctance of several potential commissioners to serve and speculates that they begged off precisely because of the radicalism of Article 6. The instructions offered by Henry Lawrence, president of the Congress, contained a mysterious, now missing enclosure and this cryptic statement: "The paper will inform you particularly the object which Congress have in view." Hermann Weldenreuther, a German historian working out of Moravian primary sources, makes a strong case that White Eyes was the driving force between Article 6, that he was bringing a sophisticated analysis to bear on the Delaware's difficult situation, and that his overriding goal was to solidify Delaware landholding, not only in relation to American settlers, but also to the Haudenosaunee and other tribes. So contextual evidence then suggests the possibility of two opposing but equally intriguing ideas: that an Indian state was an Indian proposal that made its way into the treaty, or that it was an idea that may have passed through the Continental Congress. One side, certainly, and perhaps both sides, seem to have taken this possibility seriously in some way. Well, if the counterfactual starts on this reasonable footing, what about the rest of the chain? The taking of Detroit, for instance, which is the next large claim in the narrative. It's not completely impossible to imagine. In 1763, Pontiac had given it a shot, both through surprise and a siege, though his effort was unsuccessful. Further north in that conflict, though, Ojibwe warriors had captured the fort at Michilimackinac through subterfuge. George Rogers Clark managed to capture Fort Vincennes in 1779. Lachlan McIntosh and the Americans clearly thought that if they could just make their way through the Ohio country, not easy given all the tribes allied with the British, they too could take the fort. As we stack variables on top of variables, however, the scenario grows increasingly unlikely the more deeply we move through its chronology. The march across Upper Canada, the taking of Fort Niagara, would have posed significant challenges. The Haudenosaunee, who dominated the Delaware, would have had to have been almost completely destroyed by the Sullivan campaign in order to imagine any kind of diplomatic realignment. And then the largest challenge of all, convincing the Americans to actually honor Article 6 of the treaty. So perhaps it's time to think more about what actually happened and what that reveals. If we can't quite make sense of Article 6, we can know pretty definitively what happened to White Eyes and the Delaware. After the treaty, White Eyes, as he had promised, joined Lachlan McIntosh's advance on Detroit. On November 5th, 1778, with the ink on the treaty barely dry, an American militiaman shot and killed him for no apparent reason other than that he was an Indian. The Americans then lied to the Delaware, saying that he had died of smallpox. McIntosh stalled out. The Delaware splintered with Captain Pipe, the second signer of the treaty, and the Wolf Clan moving north and joining the British. Delaware in the Ohio country had suffered from indiscriminate American violence, and they began to retaliate, in effect, shifting their alliance to the British as well. In April 1781, John Kilbuck, the treaty's third signatory, led the American Daniel Broadhead to the village of Coshocton, which the Americans destroyed. He was alienated and isolated from his people from that time on. In September 1781, the British allied Wyandotte and others rounded up the Moravian Delaware and forced them to move to the Sandusky area, ostensibly to prevent them from providing intelligence to the Americans at Fort Pitt. In February 1782, a group of 150 starving Delaware returned to their Ohio village at Gnadenhutten to collect stored food and crops that were left behind in the fields. An American militia surrounded them, took a formal democratic vote as to whether to kill them or not, decided in the affirmative, and locked them in 2 buildings for the night, which they spent in anguished prayer. The next morning, the militia members killed them deliberately and systematically. They tied the Indians up, knocked them in the head with mallets, and then tomahawked them, piled the bodies in the mission buildings, and set the whole place on fire. 28 men, 29 women, 39 children. Before the burning, they stole everything in sight. White Eye's son, George Morgan White Eyes, after serving as a subject for the racial theorizing of Professor Samuel Stanhope Smith, left Princeton 1 year shy of his degree and was shot by a white man in 1798. The other Lenape students left as well. Congress never took up the treaty. In the analytical terms of history, the state of Lenape was a contingent possibility for about 47 days. The indiscriminate racial violence, the betrayal, the hard choices, it all adds up to an impossible situation. And so why speculate about an impossible story? Can one take lessons or make arguments from such a story? What might they be? Well, first, it is worth thinking more about the allure of the story, about the affective experience of assembling it, not as a coherent historical narrative, but as a creative set of spiraling possibilities. I mentioned how fond I had grown of this story and how much I enjoyed working with this story. And so the counterfactual can become a vast temptation, leading one deeper into increasingly desperate speculation and increasingly tenuous connections. What was in the missing document sent by Henry Laurens? Was White Eye's killing an assassination? Why and by whom? Was it because of earlier connections to Lord Dunmore? True. Did the Clinton family of the Hudson River Valley have something to do with it? What was White Eye's role in George Washington's land speculations on the nearby Whitewater River? Was he really committed to the Moravians? Or was he a Satan-worshipping pedophile who drank the blood of sacrificed babies in the cellar of a nearby venison parlor? Well, I hope you're chuckling along with me here. And so, right, one starts to wonder if there's much difference between this kind of imaginative history and America's current and long-standing love of conspiracy and improbability. I'm going to leave that as an open question, but I do want to think for another minute, a couple of other ways to think about it. One follows the possibilities of the counterfactual through tests of logic that are partial and perhaps even deceptive. They're partial because, like all history, our fact set is partial. In that gap, I inserted a range of deductive speculation based on context, some reasonable, some less so. Rather than a hard-edged focus on what was possible and likely, I sometimes reverse the logic. If something wasn't necessarily impossible, like an Indian American force taking Detroit, then I took it as a wishful possibility and I inserted it into the story. If the underlying conditions about which I speculated were also not necessarily impossible, Delaware leadership, for example, then I converted them into central elements in the story. And once you start down this rabbit hole, which is fun and satisfying, you find yourself led through a twisted set of discrete and local possibilities into a big story that defies historical logic. It's a story based on facts that are determined through speculative argument rather than through evidence. It's not just that our fact set is partial either. It's that the process of narrativizing it requires other partial logics, making connections into correlations, for instance, and then into causes. Those young Delaware men at the once and future Princeton, maybe they would have become tribal leaders. There was some hereditary power at work, certainly, but they were also missing out on opportunities among their people to position themselves for leadership. And so connection becomes correlation. Or this, would the liberated American prisoner William Stacy, a connection read as a correlation, have advocated for any Indian, a correlation read into a causal action or possibility? On the other hand, maybe even this extreme version of counterfactual history is not so much like conspiracy theorizing as it seems. My example, compromised though it is, began with causes, the Treaty of 1778, and traced chains of plausible effects, struggling to stay within the semi-credible bounds of facts and conditions. Conspiracy theorists, it sometimes seems, often begin with effects. California is on fire. COVID is on a rampage. Madman shoots up a school. And then puts the imagination more in the service of causes. Jewish space lasers, lab in China, a false flag operation to take our guns away. So would it be right to say that backwards logic, creative causes, not creative effects, opens up many more possibilities for the conspiracist than are available even to the overly imaginative counterfactual historian? The conspiracy communicates affect, disenchantment, fascination, imagination, paranoia, creativity, big cultural structures of feeling. Might we say that the counterfactual does something less than that? That unlike the conspiracy, the counterfactual, even maybe not such a good one, is capable of communicating arguments, more tangible and more historical. Let me try a few. And so, a second point. I have colleagues who point to the 1964 Immigration Act as the moment when multiracial American democracy becomes a possibility. This immigrant narrative assumes assimilation and difference within a paradigm of liberal citizenship. Other colleagues respond by pointing to Reconstruction and African American politics, a much more familiar touch point that links the idea to a civil rights narrative, suggesting that the Constitution and the Declaration are being brought closer to the realization of their highest and best ideals. The story of Lenape suggests a different possibility in which multiracial democracy functions at the level of collective rather than individual rights, has distinct origins outside the constitutional tradition, and complicates immigrant assimilation narratives. Settler colonial theory predicts the erasure of indigenous histories, particularly from such foundational American narratives. Lenape, even as a fable, helps resist that kind of willful forgetting. As Indian people, distinctly outside the US Constitution, were slowly pulled into the mechanisms of the American nation over the course of the 19th century, they functioned as unique participants, often with little power, but what else is new? In a multiracial American democracy. A third point, the 47 days of Lenapean possibility reminds us in this moment of insurrection to think critically about the militia as an epistemic American social form. Recall that it was a militia officer who murdered White Eyes and militiamen who murdered the Delaware at Gnadenhutten. Backcountry-esque, libertarian, individualistic, but episodically collective, violent in protecting its goals and self-interest, the militia is best recalled not in terms of the Revolutionary Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, the way we like to think of them, but in terms of Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky. These militias were violent paramilitary settler forces organized to kill Indian people and take Indian lands. Every time we hear a Turnerian story of some pioneer farmers wielding the axe and the plow in the interests of civilizing the wilderness frontier, it's worth remembering that for decades, these were the same men eagerly grabbing their rifles and powder and running off in ungovernable gangs to kill Indians. When we point to a genealogy that runs from slave patrols to police violence, we ought to point as well to the bloodthirsty, uncontrolled violence of militias. And note the overlaps. When that organized violence was directed at the government, they were whiskey rebels, Shays rebels, anti-rent rebels, insurrectionists. When it was directed at Indians, the militia. And yes, I intend a certain presentism here. Fourth, even the unrealized possibility of Lenape reminds us that Indian people have been strategizing within and in relation to the structures of the American state since before it was an American state, and that they have sometimes found allies within that state willing to advocate for forms of Indian political autonomy. In 1907, the Southern historian Annie Abel was able to trace proposals for an Indian state over the course of a century, from the Delaware Treaty to the late 1870s. Her work, which focuses on promises and efforts surrounding removal and Indian territory, was likely inspired by that recent 1905 Sequoia Convention, in which Indian Territory tribes wrote a constitution and a plan for counties and government, named delegates, and filed a formal petition for statehood. Today, in light of the McGirt Supreme Court decision expanding Indian country jurisdiction across eastern Oklahoma, such histories, even when turned in other directions, actually speak to the historical roots of present and future possibilities. And so finally, Lenape reminds us of the political status of federally recognized tribes today. Their place established by treaties very much like the 1778 Treaty of Fort Pitt. As my colleague Joe Singer observes, don't we actually have not 4, but 574 indigenous states of America right now? Semi-autonomous political entities with self-governance, dual citizenship, existing in structured relationships with other American states and with the federal government. So Lenape can seem, both in the moment and in retrospect, as just an odd little quirk of history, kind of a crazy little hiccup. But just maybe it was not so crazy after all. Thank you, and I will look forward to chatting more with you during our question and answer.
Philip Deloria, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. You know, one of the questions that came up in some quarters was, what does the talk about Lenape have to do with our theme of fact and fraud in the digital age? Well, if you ignore the digital age element, you can see that the tie-in had to do with conspiracy theories, with the counterfactual as a way of understanding historic possibilities and so on. So I think there are connections there that we'll explore in future talks, including one about conspiracy theories and their persistence in the United States. It isn't. Anyway, I look forward to seeing some of you at 4 o'clock Mountain. And if you can't make that event, I hope you join us for our future events. Thank you very much.